What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of JAR. JAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe.
And Amy.
Review. It's our weekly show where we go over the magic stories as they're posted on Wizards' website. We are in the midst of the Ixalan set of stories, and this week we have A Question of Confidence, once again by the R&D narrative team. At the start of the episode, I just want to apologize. We don't know if you can hear it or not, but if you can, there's some music in the background. The people who live underneath us don't understand the concept of a volume knob, so apologies in advance for that. There's really nothing we can do about that. But for our quick review in the beginning, I'm going to say, and we'll get more into this in the actual full review itself, I thought that this story was cool. I thought that it did a good job of introducing us to new characters and giving us a taste of some where I personally really want to see more of them. But I will also say that at the end of this story, it completely falls apart. And it kind of feels to me like you kind of lose out on the enjoyable aspects of the beginning because you are left with the confusing ending. And to some, it might just ruin the experience entirely. I was able to try to go back and remember the good stuff, so I still recommend that you go read it. Just be aware that if it's weird at the end, don't be like, oh, Joe said this was good. I thought it was, but at the end it gets a little wonky. What are your thoughts?
My review is that it is skippable. And if you are skipping it, I will go on in this video to tell you the only things you need to know.
That's fair.
So that you can skip it.
That's fair. I will say, obviously, because we film these in real time based on the releases, if there is a lot of information in this story that pertains to future stories or that we need to have heard to understand future stories, we don't know that as of today. So if you're watching this weeks later and you're like, what the hell are you talking about? This story had all these things that relate to we don't know that. But we do know that, I do know that following along with the story spotlight cards, the cards themselves, and their names, there really was not a lot of information here, except, as Amy said, we'll probably hit on those bigger points as we go through the review. So that's the quick review in the beginning. If you want to read the story first, please go do so. We review, we do not summarize, although again, we will be touching on important points, but we won't do them justice if that is something that you are interested in reading in its true and honest form. On to the full review itself. This was the first story of Ixalan with non-Gatewatch characters, with characters that we'd never met before. An entire story with entirely new characters. There was not a single character that we saw from beginning to end that we had ever seen before in a story. We've seen Watley as the planeswalker was spoiled a while ago, but we had not actually seen her or any of them in storyline. So this was an entirely new cast of characters. That used to be something that worried me when that happened, because until Amonkhet came around, and then we met characters like Samut and Jeru and got to see what these characters were like, and the fact that the story team, or now the narrative team, could really take new characters and make us interested enough in them that I didn't care that there wasn't a recognizable face or voice. Did this one do that just as well? I wouldn't say so, my personal opinion. They were interesting characters, and I liked some of the interactions. Excuse me. But I don't know that it was Amonkhet quality. I think it was a little bit less. I don't know if you agree with that.
It certainly wasn't that kind of quality. I would say that there were pieces that were, like I said before, important. And there were things that were said about the characters, interactions between the characters maybe, that made it kind of cool, but a lot of the information that was in that story was I feel insignificant. Maybe we'll go on to learn that some of the things I think now are insignificant don't actually turn out to be insignificant, but I doubt it.
Yeah,
Sorry.
No, but that was my point from the beginning, was like, maybe we'll find out in weeks to come that like this story was pretty important to introduce all this stuff to us. But
I feel like we say that every time, but this time I feel like we say it with a lot more disappointment in our voice.
well, and a lot more of a lack of confidence, because I don't think that a lot of this information will matter.
Right.
The story attempted to characterize Watley for us. It attempted to tell us her motivations, show us her character, and really introduce her to us. And it did that, but then it did it again. And then it did it again. And it was like, okay, I get it. And it really felt like, unfortunately, and this may be a little mean, but it felt like there wasn't enough to her to fill this whole story. So they just kept repeating the same things over and over again because they had to justify the fact that they were giving her a full story.
I would say, if that was the case, they could have just made it shorter.
Agreed. I definitely agree.
I think that what the issue may have been was that there were, a phrase that you like to often say, too many cooks. I think everyone was given a concept and everybody wrote a little bit, and then they just kind of pieced it together, and it didn't flow or make sense together, and it was repetitive.
So some of the examples that I wrote, because originally it was funny, I was reading through the end, towards the end of the story. As I said, in my opinion, in the end, this story completely fell apart. It was like okay, right? It was coasting along, and then towards the end it started doing like a steady decline and then just cliffed off.
Yeah, just plummeted.
It was crazy to see that process occur, because
to the point where I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
We had to scroll back and read it again because we didn't believe that it was that bad.
Yeah, and I pointed it out.
I don't want to say that, but I have to. I don't know what else to say.
Again, aspects of it were bad. In no way are we saying the whole story was bad.
No,
there were
just
important
that
parts.
One area.
Yes, and because I had written down in my notes that I felt like it was getting a little repetitive. They mentioned at one point that the city, the Golden City of Oraska, is more myth than reality. And then a couple of paragraphs later, when Watley is talking to Inti, I believe, she says, I didn't think I'd be going on this journey for a city that's more myth than reality. That is a very specific phrase that you can't use 3 paragraphs apart from one another in the same story, even if she thinks it and then says it. Like, that stuff happens in the real world.
Unless it's going to play a really big part in the story. And the only thing that I can guess that might warrant using it 3 or 4 times in the story.
They only used that twice, but there was a lot of other repetition.
It was at least 3.
Okay, so there you go.
The only thing that I can think of that would warrant that is if we come to find if she actually does end up getting to
the Golden City.
Oraska. City, and then it's not Oraska because Oraska is a mythological city, and it's...
I mean, I think at this point it's pretty inevitable that we will see this Golden City, or we will see Oraska, whether it is truly in the form that all of these groups believe it to be or not. The whole story of Ixalan is all of these groups converging to find the Golden City, and for good or for bad, one way or another, that city's getting found. Yeah,
but what I think that might be trying to clue us into is that they'll find the city, but they'll find that it's not what they were looking for.
Right. That's fair.
They talked. I feel like they talked a lot about exploration and stuff like that, and the Aztecs.
Voyages and yes.
No, and the Aztecs when talking about Ixalan, and what they were gonna, or the concepts used to create that plane. So it kind of makes me feel like it's gonna be sort of a discovering America and it's not really India kind of a feel.
Right. No, that's fair. Yeah.
And so that might be why they use that phrase so many times. Like, no, the place that you're thinking of isn't really the place that you're going to end up, but the place that you're going to end up is still a cool place, whatever it is.
Right. And that kind of leads me to jumping back in to something positive. One thing that I appreciated that this story did, and it did it relatively subtly, but was something I was still able to figure out, and I'm sure many of you were as well, was just the comparisons that could be drawn, as Amy said, to older real-world historical versions of exploration or colonization or whatever you want to call it. And they talked about things like building the Sun Empire on top of the older empire, which was built on top of older empires because there were lots of people vying for power and there was expansionism going on. That's perfect. And someone who is not aware of history, like a younger kid who may not have gotten to that point in their classes yet, they may read this and be like, oh, that's cool. But the fact that, if you're older and you remember that stuff from school, I mean, I am by far not a history guy. I remember some stuff, but I usually leave that to Amy, especially in these videos, but really just in life. That's just not my thing.
I usually leave it to the internet.
Nice. This did a good example or did a good job of giving us examples and metaphor of comparing those things and showing you how this plane was inspired by those real world historical events.
Right, and
I liked that.
And how those real world later in time empires were influenced by the earlier in time empires that they conquered.
Yes.
I mean...
Yeah. Or didn't learn and just suffered the exact same fate.
Right. Well, I mean...
Depends on the empire.
Arguably, every empire suffers that fate.
Yep.
That's history.
It's all cyclical. Yeah. No, that's fair.
One day, life as we know it now will loop back into something that is not at all what we know it to be now.
Yeah, and I mean, we have the we live, I was going to say something terrible. We live in the States ourselves, if you aren't aware of that, and maybe you do as well, maybe you don't. But we live in the United States, and we are able to see in other countries around the world that kind of thing is still happening to this day. You still have revolutions and overthrowing of governments and kind of taking over of ruling parties being taken over and whatever. That kind of thing is still happening in a more modern way than this is talking about.
But it always will be.
Correct. Well, as we were saying, it is a cyclical thing.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, as long as the human race still exists, that will always be the case.
That's fair. I mean, there's that phrase about those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it or whatever, but still, it's the kind of thing where you look at history and...
You're talking about it as though it's a bad thing, and I don't see it that way.
I guess it depends on who you are in that scenario. If you're the ruling party, I'm sure you're pretty upset about that thing happening.
Well, anyone in that scenario will really be upset because whether you are being overthrown or you're in a revolution, either way, you're not the happiest person at the time.
Right.
But I mean, history being what it is, it just it's not a bad thing because it's simply just life. It's reality.
Mm-hmm. I think that it'll be interesting. So that was one aspect of the story that I enjoyed. I thought that was a nice way of introducing us to what this plane is meant to be, what it was based off of and inspired by. And I think it did that well in a very brief and concise way without kind of making it super obvious that that's what the story was doing.
Yeah.
And then we got to the later end of the story, as we said, where then they started
got muddled.
They started just beating us over the head with Watley's characterization and, you know, the fact that she's a voyager and an explorer, and they used that phrase a million times, and they said that she didn't think that she could be anything more than she thought she could be, and then two sentences later
she didn't think she could be anything more than she was, which didn't make any sense to me because the whole freaking story, you were talking about how you wanted to be the
warrior poet. But I think she expected that she would just gain the title of warrior poet and not have to be an explorer or a voyager to gain that title because she thought she'd already earned it.
Because it had nothing to do with that title. The title was not associated with exploration of any kind.
Correct.
The title was associated with being a good speaker, a good poet, and a good warrior, and beloved by the people of the city, or nation, or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And she did have all of those things, so she expected to gain that title. That's not just, I don't think that she felt that it would keep her the same, as she was before. I think that that's foolish.
And the thing that I find interesting is her card in this set her Planeswalker card is called Watley Warrior Poet. Now, there are two ways that could be looked at, because what the Emperor told her was, Apatzek told her was, you will gain the title of Warrior Poet when you find this golden city and bring back the immortal sun, which, as we know from listening to the podcast describing this plane, that's the story that we're going to be presented with, is everyone is going to try to find the golden city and get the immortal sun.
So does that mean that she does in fact find the golden city? Or does it simply mean, because if you recall in the story, she said that that everyone of the city had already granted her that title, even though it wasn't official.
Correct.
So people called her that, even though she wasn't.
Including the Emperor, after he told her that she'd have to earn it. He said something like, okay, now go forth, warrior poet. And it was like, you just said that's not what she was saying.
Contradictory and weird and bad.
And I think that was kind of where I'm talking about, where it kind of started going down. Because then Watley thought her opinions of what the Emperor had just said. And then the next scene is her sitting with Inti and telling Inti her opinions of what the Emperor just said. You don't need to tell it to me twice. I was there 10 seconds ago.
Right.
So why repeat it? And then at the end, there were, I wrote it down because I was just writing stuff down. There were grammatical errors at the end, and it just made no sense. And it was repeating like the same thing from one paragraph to the next. And by paragraph, I mean like 2 lines.
Yeah.
And then a paragraph break, and then the same thing again.
Yeah.
It was very just odd at the end.
And bad.
And yet, in the beginning, I liked where she was talking about saying that the Legion of Dusk were inferior craftsmen. Right, and you even commented on that. I thought that was a great dig at them, and it also, again, we're talking about the inspirations for this set and things that we learned from listening to the story podcast on Ixalan. We learned that the narrative team has been trying very hard to not make this typical the natives are the primitives, and so they're the ones that are going to be sitting there in their loincloths and spears.
Destiny.
Right.
This isn't,
Right. And the stronger, more advanced people are going to show up and just kill them all.
Right.
You get that opportunity for Whatley to say, they're inferior craftsmen. I don't understand how they consider themselves to be conquerors.
Right.
That's a great dig. That's awesome. And it worked out.
And it helps all of us keep them on a more equal footing in our own minds when we're thinking about the different tribes of this plane.
Correct. Yeah. And then I loved I liked the introduction of Angrath as well. I liked the idea that when I saw him, I was like, there's a Minotaur on Ixalan. I was like, that's weird. Now, I had known going in that he was a planeswalker because Twitter during the day and people talking about it before I had a chance to come home from work and actually read the story. But he revealed it as well, himself, by pointing at her when she gained her spark and saying, you're one too. And you got to see him with the fire burning inside of him and being able to heat his chain, which was very Ghost Rider of him.
Yeah.
But he was able to use his heated chain to whip at her and immediately kill her dinosaur, and yet, only grab at her leg. And then he just saw that she was a planeswalker and he was like, cool, come with me. And
because he's been trying for God knows how long to get off of this godforsaken plane.
Right.
And he can't do it by himself.
Right. And so he said, we'll do it together.
Said she's the only planeswalker he has found.
Right. Which means that maybe it's time for him to meet Jason Vraska. Maybe it's not. Who knows? But that was really cool.
Maybe the four of them team up to find the Golden City.
I don't see that happening, but that's possible because we already know who Whatley's going there with.
Well,
she's going with Inti and what I assume is pronounced Taya, although I am not
planeswalkers.
Correct, they're not planeswalkers, but I don't think Whatley cares. Whatley doesn't know the difference.
Right, but my point is she's not going to get there with them.
Well, the Golden City is presumably on Ixalan. If you're talking about Kaladesh, that's a different story. Right. But when Whatley planeswalked, which really was as she described it, and I liked the descriptions used for the failed planeswalk for someone who had no idea what she was doing. She said she felt like she was going up to an open door or an open window, and she simply got the opportunity to look through before she was pulled back and the door was slammed in her face. I liked that. That made sense to me, and I liked the description used for that. I thought that was a really neat way of doing it. And then the kind of the sigil of the circular triangle shape that they talked about, and the fact that everyone can see it. But I also find it interesting.
Both of those things to me feel a little bit like Full Metal Alchemist-ish.
Okay. I'm not a Full Metal Alchemist guy, but Amy is 100% a Full Metal Alchemist gal. So feel free to talk about it in the comments, and she'll be able to respond. But yeah, it also, I found it interesting because she then went and told the Emperor about everything she had experienced, and so now you have Inti and the Emperor who are not fully aware, because even Whatley's not fully aware, but are aware of planeswalking as a concept, or at least what it'll do, even though none of them know that the plane is bound in some way.
Right.
Except that Angrath knows it, at least, again, as a concept, because he knows he can't leave. Maybe Vraska has more information on that, because she's been working with Nicol Bolas, and so maybe she came here for a reason. So we'll find out more about that as the weeks go on, I'm sure. But that was kind of this story. I don't think that there was Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, you were going to say something. Please go right ahead.
I can't remember what it was.
All right, keep thinking about it, because the last thing I wanted to say was I also really enjoyed, and I saw somebody on Twitter mentioning this as well, I really enjoyed the fact that when she did planeswalk, again, quote unquote, because it wasn't really, she didn't go there, she just saw it and then got ripped back, she saw Kaladesh. Kaladesh. Our set makes sense now. That's totally why we did it. But it makes, she saw Kaladesh, and she saw a golden city with a lot of advancements, and and the sky was filled with magic, and that in and of itself, to someone who has lived on a plane, someone who understands magic, because she has utilized it to speak with dinosaurs, much better power than Aquaman's. But she can speak with dinosaurs and command them and summon them. And she can kind of amplify her own voice to talk to people, which makes sense for an orator, as she called herself, as a public speaker. It makes sense that she would be fascinated by not only a golden city, but a golden city with a sky filled with magic. Whereas to others, that might be kind of intimidating.
Yeah.
It makes sense that she would really appreciate it and want to go there and see it. And that is, it also kind of makes sense now why, as people were asking, and I kind of had the question myself, but people were asking, why now? If all these people knew that the Golden City existed, or at least knew that the Golden City existed, because it's a myth, but they believe that it's a real place, why is now the time when all of these groups are now converging to try to go to that place? And at least for the Sun Empire, it's because Whatley, seeing it in her vision, I'm doing air quotes a lot tonight, but seeing it in her vision made it so that the Emperor was convinced enough to send people there, because, as he said, usually it was his mother's thing before she died that she sought it out, whereas he is all about expansionism and wanting to expand his reach and control.
As he said, the reason why there are all these people trying to infiltrate and find this city is because his mother died and he took the reins of the Empire.
Okay.
That
maybe I missed that.
That change in the Empire. Well, he didn't say that, but he didn't have to.
Okay.
That change in ruler is the weak spot that all of these other empires see.
Okay.
As an opportunity to try and look for the Golden City.
Yeah, and we'll see how that goes. I mean, you've got Sun Empire, Legion of Dusk. They were talking about the fighting that they did to push the Legion of Dusk out of the Sun Coast, which is how Whatley got the sword, and etc. And so, yeah, that we'll see where Angrath falls into this. We'll see if and how Vraska and Jace come into play here. Mm-hmm. Did you remember what you were going to say, or are we good?
I did not.
Okay. Maybe in the coming weeks. Stay tuned.
Maybe I'll write it in the comments.
Maybe. But so guys, this has been another episode of JaAR. Let us know what you thought in the comments down below. Did you dislike this story because of the ending? Was the ending not as offensive to you and you feel like we're going a little over the top? Let us know.
I did remember.
Sure, go ahead. She remembered. Go for it.
You mentioned the fact that yeah, you mentioned the fact that the Minotaur guy, what was his name again?
Angrath.
You mentioned the fact that he, all of a sudden, once he sees that she's a planeswalker, actually cares about, we get to see his desperation.
Yes.
And, she's confused about what's happening, but he's like, perfect. The my way out.
Yeah.
And
it was a complete 180.
Yeah.
Like right there in front of her, just like I'm literally trying to murder you. You're a planeswalker. Come with me. Just so immediate. It was very cool. I mean, I liked it because, like you said, it really does help to show that. So yeah, I agree.
Well, and it spoon feeds you the fact that he's from another plane.
Besides the fact that she keeps saying strangest beast she's ever seen, and it's nothing like what we know to be on Ixalan, so yeah.
And we know some planes that do have minotaurs, so
correct.
We can kind of gather some maybes about where he's from.
Correct. There are a lot of different ideas, and there were a lot of ideas thrown around online about who he is. I'm going to keep quiet on those for now. They're rumors and they're speculation, although seemingly very plausible. I'm going to wait until we get a little bit more information on him, because I'm sure this is not the last time we're going to see him. He has not, as of yet, been spoiled for this set, and so if he's not going to be in this set, I assume he'll be in the next one. Ooh. Explorers of Ixalan, I believe it's called. I don't know yet. But if that's the case, then we'll see him in the next set, and I'm sure he'll be in more stories. And so we'll have more opportunities to talk about him. But we shall see where that goes. As I said, let us know what you thought of our opinions in the comments down below. Leave us your opinions as well. We would love to have discussions with any and all of you about what you thought of this story.
Yes.
Overall, did you like this story better than last week's? You kind of weren't so high on last week's.
Definitely not.
Okay.
Last week's, you know what? Last week's reminded me very much of like the required reading from school. You know, like
the Hatchet.
Yeah, the Hatchet.
We might be showing our age. I hope people still read that story in school.
Oh, Lord. I mean, the Hatchet was significantly better.
I like that book a lot. It was a cool book.
But, yeah, I mean, it had a very direct theme, and it, you know, it was a story, and it was a good story. It just wasn't necessarily my favorite kind of story.
Fair enough.
This story had some serious problems with it.
I think in terms of information gathering, I think this story was better, but in general, I think last week's was, but I don't know.
I mean, yes, technically.
New information
but I
gathering.
don't think it gave us as much as it could have. Because like you said, it was so repetitive that...
Which I agreed with something that you said when we were talking about this before we turned the camera on. Amy mentioned, and I'll give you full credit for it, that it would have made the story a welcome amount shorter. The story was not oppressively long, but it was long enough where I was like, all right, it's getting to be a little long. And then I realized how much repetition there was, and I was like, just cut all that out, and it would have been a reasonable length story. Yeah. But instead,
it made you extremely frustrated.
I was a little annoyed
because you didn't like how long it was before it got so repetitive and awful, and then it got repetitive and awful.
Right,
so.
which it stinks, because if that was in the beginning, which it would kind of be difficult for it to be repetitive in the beginning, but it could have done it with how repetitive it was at the end. But regardless, if it had been that way in the beginning and all of the meat of it had been at the end, I at least would have walked away having been remembering the meaty parts that gave us the most information, instead of walking away being like...
I feel like the repetitiveness was just a way to kind of build you up to it. Kind of give you that anticipation that you needed to find that meat. Yeah.
Instead of having us walk away with that sour taste in our mouth of, oh my God.
Yeah, like what the hell happened?
What just happened? What did I just read? It is our job to, with this show, to go back and analyze every part.
It's not our job. We don't get paid to do this.
But don't get us wrong. We do go back and analyze every part of the story, so we are able to go back and say, but this was good, and this was good, and this was good. And so, but if I were just reading this story...
It's important to be objective and thorough.
Yes. But if I were reading this story, that's probably what I would have harped on the most, was... just, wow, that ending sucked. And then moving on, and that would be what I would remember from this story, as opposed to all of the cool things that we've already talked about.
Yeah.
So, we will see where this goes next week. This has been another episode of JAR. We are all set here. Thank you for joining us as we showed off our...
#Vorthos Pride.
I've been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
And as we always say, guys, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.